My name is Tom Sherman. In 1994, my wife Gwen and I moved with our 2 children, Jake and Annie, to a 512-acre ranch in northeastern Utah. We'd been searching for a property like this for years, a quiet place to raise our family, far from the chaos of city life. Gwen called it our dream ranch, with its endless rolling fields, mountain views, and a weathered but sturdy farmhouse nestled at the center of the property. It felt perfect, too good to be true. We purchased the ranch at an unbelievably low price. The previous owners, an older couple, seemed eager to leave. They avoided answering questions about the property's history, brushing off our curiosity with vague remarks. I still remember the way the old man shook my hand with an odd reluctance, his grip weak and his gaze distant. "Good luck," he muttered before climbing into his truck and driving off without so much as a glance back. It didn't take long for us to notice that something was off about the ranch. At first, it was subtle, a strange silence that settled over the land at dusk, as if the very air held its breath. The cattle, which we'd brought in to start our livestock operations, seemed skittish. They would often huddle together, staring nervously at the tree line that bordered the western pasture. The dogs, too, began behaving strangely. Normally bold and energetic, they refused to venture far from the house after sunset. Then came the wolf. It was late afternoon when Jake and I first saw it. We were out by the western pasture, inspecting the fence line, when a movement caught my eye. At first, I thought it was just another stray dog, but as it approached, I realized how wrong I was. This creature was massive, easily the size of a small pony. Its fur was a shimmering gray, almost silver, and its eyes. I'll never forget those eyes. They weren't the eyes of an animal. They were intelligent, almost human, and they seemed to look right through me. The wolf approached the herd slowly, almost lazily, as if it had no fear of us. One of the calves, a young black and white heifer, wandered too close. Before I could react, the wolf lunged, clamping its massive jaws around the calf's neck. I shouted and grabbed my rifle from the truck, firing 2 quick shots into the creature's flank. The bullets hit, I was sure of it, but the wolf didn't even flinch. It was as if the shots had no effect at all. Jake, panicking, grabbed a bat from the truck and swung at the creature with all his might. The wolf finally released the calf, but instead of retreating like a normal predator, it turned to face us. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The wolf stared at us, its glowing eyes filled with a cold, almost mocking intelligence. Then, without a sound, it turned and trotted back toward the tree line, disappearing into the shadows as if it had never been there. The calf survived, but it was badly shaken. Its neck bore deep puncture wounds, too clean and precise to be from any normal animal. Jake and I returned to the house, shaken but determined to figure out what we had just encountered. When we told Gwen what had happened, her face went pale. "I've heard stories," she said, her voice trembling. "From the locals. They say this land is cursed. They talk about skinwalkers." At the time, I didn't know what a skinwalker was, nor did I care. I was a practical man, and I didn't believe in fairy tales or old legends. But as the days passed, and the strange events continued to pile up, I began to wonder if there might be more to those stories than I was willing to admit. After the wolf attack, the uneasy feeling that had been simmering since we arrived on the ranch grew stronger. Gwen's mention of skinwalkers hung heavy in the air, though I still refused to entertain the idea of such supernatural nonsense. I chalked up the incident to a rogue predator, a freakishly large one, but nothing more. Still, there was an undeniable change in the atmosphere of the ranch. The following nights were eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustling of leaves or the distant call of a night bird. The sense of being watched became almost unbearable. At first, I thought it was my imagination, the lingering shock from the wolf encounter playing tricks on my mind. But Gwen felt it too. She would pause mid-task, staring out the window toward the tree line, her brows furrowed. "Do you feel that?" she asked one evening as we sat on the porch. "Feel what?" I replied, though I knew exactly what she meant. "That presence," she said quietly, her eyes scanning the darkening fields. "Like someone's out there, watching us." I didn't answer. How could I, when I'd felt it too? The dog started behaving strangely. Normally, they were fearless, roaming the property freely and barking at the slightest disturbance. But now, they refused to leave the barn after sundown. They would huddle together in a corner, their ears flat and their tails tucked between their legs. It was as if they sensed something that we couldn't. One evening, as I was locking up the tool shed, I felt it again, that gaze. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and my skin prickled with cold. I spun around, shining my flashlight toward the fence line, but saw nothing. Yet the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each passing second. I called out, my voice echoing into the night. "Who's there?" No answer. Only the rustle of wind through the grass. I told myself it was nothing, just paranoia getting the better of me. But deep down, I knew better. Something, or someone, was out there. The lights began appearing a week later. At first, they were faint, distant glimmers on the horizon, barely distinguishable from the stars. But over time, they grew brighter and closer, hovering above the western fields like silent sentinels. They moved in ways that defied logic, zigzagging through the sky, stopping abruptly, and then shooting off at impossible speeds. We tried to come up with rational explanations. Maybe it was military aircraft, conducting some kind of experimental tests. After all, we weren't far from Dugway Proving Ground, a military site often referred to as the Area 51 of Utah. But even that theory felt flimsy. No human technology could move the way those lights did. One night, Gwen woke me up in a panic. "Tom, come quick," she whispered urgently, pulling me out of bed. I followed her to the living room, where she pointed out the window. In the distance, a bluish orb floated above the treetops. It was about the size of a basketball, pulsating softly as it moved toward the ground. We watched in stunned silence as it hovered there for several seconds before disappearing in a flash of light. The next morning, we found strange markings in the western pasture. The grass was flattened in a perfect circle, the edges burned and charred. There were no footprints, no tire tracks, nothing to suggest how the marks had been made. Jake became fascinated with the lights, spending hours outside with his camcorder, hoping to catch one on tape. But every time he tried, the camera would malfunction. The screen would fizzle, or the footage would come out distorted, as if the very presence of the lights disrupted the equipment. Annie, on the other hand, grew increasingly anxious. She started refusing to go outside after dark, claiming she could hear voices whispering her name whenever she stepped onto the porch. "They're calling me," she said one night, her voice trembling. "They want me to come to them." Gwen and I dismissed it as a child's overactive imagination, but the fear in her eyes was real. And as much as I tried to deny it, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was truth to her words. I reached out to the neighbors, hoping they might have some answers. The Thompsons, who lived about 10 miles away, were the closest thing we had to friends in this isolated part of the country. When I mentioned the strange lights, old Mr. Thompson's face darkened. "You don't want to mess with that land, Sherman," he said gravely. "Keep your head down and your family safe. That's the best advice I can give you." "What do you mean?" I pressed. He hesitated, then shook his head. "Just stay away from the western fields after dark." His words did little to ease my growing unease. If anything, they only deepened the mystery. What was it about this land that seemed to draw the strange and the unexplainable? And more importantly, what had we gotten ourselves into? The lights became a nightly occurrence, their presence impossible to ignore. By the time October rolled around, Gwen and I had stopped trying to come up with rational explanations. There were none. These weren't military aircraft, weather phenomena, or anything else that made sense. The lights behaved like living things, darting, pausing, and sometimes seeming to observe us. One evening, Jake called us outside, shouting for us to hurry. We rushed to find him standing in the middle of the yard, his camcorder in hand. "Look," he said, pointing to the sky. Above the western fields hovered a massive, pulsating light. It wasn't like the smaller orbs we'd seen before. This was enormous, a fiery ball of orange and red that cast an eerie glow over the landscape. It moved slowly, almost lazily, before stopping abruptly and shooting upward at an impossible speed. "Did you get that?" Gwen asked, her voice trembling. Jake looked down at the camcorder and cursed. The screen was blank, the battery completely drained despite having been fully charged just an hour earlier. The following morning, I ventured out to the field where the light had appeared. There, in the center of the pasture, was another strange marking. The grass was flattened in a perfect spiral, with scorch marks radiating outward. I knelt down to examine it, my fingers brushing against the charred edges. The air still smelled faintly of ozone and burnt metal. The cattle were acting strangely too. They refused to go near the marked area, bellowing nervously whenever I tried to herd them closer. One heifer, a normally docile animal, kicked violently when I attempted to lead her past it. Gwen was growing increasingly anxious. She insisted we contact someone, an expert, a scientist, anyone who could explain what was happening. But I hesitated. Who would believe us? And even if they did, what could they do? That night, Annie came into our room, her face pale. "They're outside," she whispered. "What are you talking about?" Gwen asked, sitting up in bed. "The shadows," Annie said. "They're watching us." We followed her to the living room, where she pointed out the window. At first, I didn't see anything, but then I noticed it, a tall, humanoid figure standing at the edge of the tree line. It was barely visible, its dark form blending with the shadows, but there was no mistaking its presence. I grabbed my rifle and stormed outside, shouting for whoever, or whatever, it was to show themselves. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished into the darkness. That was the first time I truly felt fear, not just unease or anxiety, but a deep, primal terror that I couldn't shake. Something was out there, something that didn't belong. And it was getting closer. The lights continued to torment us, appearing almost every night. Jake and I tried to stay awake to monitor them, but no matter how hard we tried, they always seemed to vanish just as we began to understand their movements. Then came the night when the lights converged. It started like any other evening, with a faint glow of orbs hovering over the fields. But this time, they began to move together, circling above the western pasture like a swarm of fireflies. Slowly, they merged into a single, blinding light that illuminated the entire area. I could barely look at it, the intensity burning my eyes. But out of the corner of my vision, I saw something emerge from the center of the light, a figure. It was tall and slender, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its head was elongated, and its eyes glowed a piercing white. Gwen screamed, and I grabbed her hand, pulling her back toward the house. Jake and Annie were already inside, their faces pale with terror. The figure didn't follow us. Instead, it stood motionless, silhouetted against the brilliant light. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the light vanished, leaving behind only darkness and silence. That night, I made the decision to sell the ranch. Whatever was happening here, it was beyond anything I could handle. But escaping wouldn't be as easy as I thought. The morning after the lights converged, the entire family was on edge. Gwen and I agreed that it was time to leave. We would put the ranch up for sale, pack what we could, and move back to the city. But as I stood at the kitchen table with a phone in hand, something strange happened. The line was dead. I frowned, jiggling the cord and checking the receiver. It wasn't the first time the phones had gone out, but this felt deliberate, as though something, or someone, didn't want us reaching the outside world. "No service again?" Gwen asked, her voice tense. I nodded grimly. "Looks like it. Maybe we should drive into town and call from there," she suggested. It sounded like a good plan. We gathered the kids, loaded into the truck, and headed down the dirt road that led to the main highway. But halfway there, the truck sputtered and stalled. The engine, which had been running perfectly fine that morning, refused to turn over. I climbed out, cursing under my breath, and popped the hood. Everything looked fine, no loose wires, no visible damage. Yet the engine remained stubbornly dead. "What's wrong, Dad?" Jake asked from the backseat. "I don't know," I admitted, wiping sweat from my brow. "It just stopped." We were stranded. Reluctantly, we walked back to the house, the silence of the surrounding fields pressing down on us. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, though I saw nothing unusual. When we finally made it back, we discovered something that sent chills down my spine. The house, which we had left locked and secure, was wide open. The front door stood ajar, swinging gently in the breeze. "Stay here," I told Gwen and the kids, grabbing my rifle from the porch. I stepped inside cautiously, my heart pounding. The living room was untouched, but as I moved through the house, I began to notice small changes. Drawers pulled open, chairs overturned, a strange smell that reminded me of sulfur. The worst discovery was in the kitchen. On the floor, written in a dark, sticky substance, was a symbol I didn't recognize. It looked ancient, almost tribal, with sharp angles and interlocking patterns. "What is it?" Gwen asked, peeking in from the doorway. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice trembling. "But it wasn't here before." That night, we barricaded ourselves in the house. I moved furniture in front of the doors and windows, keeping my rifle close at hand. The kids slept fitfully, huddled together on the couch, while Gwen and I took turns keeping watch. At around 3 a.m., the dogs started barking furiously. Their frantic yelps echoed through the night, loud and desperate. I grabbed my rifle and ran to the back door, but before I could reach it, the barking stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. I opened the door cautiously, shining my flashlight into the yard. The dogs were gone. Their chains lay on the ground, twisted and broken, but there was no sign of a struggle. "Tom," Gwen whispered behind me. "What's happening to us?" I didn't have an answer. The following day, I tried fixing the truck, but every time I thought I'd solved the problem, something else would go wrong. It was as if the vehicle didn't want to leave. The phones were still dead, and even Jake's battery-operated radio refused to pick up a signal. We were completely cut off. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the lights returned. But this time, they were different. Instead of hovering above the fields, they surrounded the house, circling us like a predator stalking its prey. "Everyone, get inside," I shouted, ushering Gwen and the kids back into the house. The lights grew brighter, their glow seeping through the cracks in the walls and windows. The air inside grew thick and oppressive, making it hard to breathe. Suddenly, there was a loud banging on the roof. It sounded like heavy footsteps, moving steadily toward the edge. Jake screamed, pointing toward the window. Outside, a figure stood silhouetted against the light. It was the same creature I'd seen before, tall, slender, and utterly alien. It stared at us through the glass, its glowing eyes filled with an unnatural intelligence. "Leave us alone," I shouted, raising my rifle. But before I could fire, the creature disappeared, melting into the light. 4 hours, we huddled together in the living room, waiting for the nightmare to end. When the lights finally vanished, the house was plunged into darkness. None of us slept that night. By morning, it was clear that we were prisoners. The ranch wasn't just cursed, it was alive, and it wasn't letting us go. The ranch felt different the next morning, heavier somehow, as though the air itself was saturated with something unseen and malevolent. Even the sunlight seemed dimmer, struggling to penetrate the oppressive gloom. None of us spoke as we sat around the breakfast table, picking at our food. The tension was suffocating, and the silence made it worse. Jake broke the stillness first. "We can't stay here," he said, his voice firm despite the fear in his eyes. "We know," I replied, though my voice lacked the conviction I wanted it to have. "But we can't leave. Not yet." "What do you mean, not yet?" Gwen snapped. "Tom, we can't stay here another night. Whatever is out there, it's getting closer." She was right. The lights, the markings, the figures, they weren't just phenomena anymore. They were escalating, closing in on us like a noose. But what could we do? The truck wouldn't start, the phones were still dead, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. "I'll figure something out," I promised, though the words felt hollow. That afternoon, I decided to try walking to the Thompsons' ranch. It was a long shot, but I couldn't think of any other option. I loaded my rifle, packed some water, and told Gwen to lock the doors and keep the kids inside until I got back. "Be careful," she said, her voice trembling. "I will," I assured her, though I wasn't so sure myself. The walk was eerily quiet. The fields that had once seemed so peaceful now felt hostile, as if the land itself resented my presence. I kept my eyes on the tree line, half expecting to see one of the figures watching me. About halfway to the Thompsons' property, I noticed something strange. The ground beneath my feet felt soft, almost spongy, as if I were walking on a thin crust over something hollow. I stopped and crouched down, brushing the grass aside. Beneath the surface was a network of tunnels, perfectly round, like burrows, but far too large to have been made by any animal I knew. A low hum filled the air, faint but persistent. It seemed to come from the tunnels, vibrating through the ground and into my bones. My skin prickled, and a wave of nausea washed over me. Whatever was beneath this land, it wasn't natural. I turned back, abandoning my trek to the Thompsons. I didn't know why, but some instinct told me it was safer to return to the house. When I arrived, I found Gwen and the kids in a state of panic. "Where were you?" Gwen demanded, her voice shaking. "I was checking the fields," I lied, not wanting to scare her further. "Why? What happened?" "They were here," she said, her eyes darting to the windows. "The shadows. They were at the windows, Tom. Watching us. Did they try to get in?" I asked, gripping my rifle tighter. "No," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "But they don't have to. They're everywhere." That night, the lights returned. But this time, they didn't stay outside. It started with a low rumble, like distant thunder, that shook the house. The lights seeped through the walls, bathing the room in an otherworldly glow. The air became thick, making it hard to breathe. And then the whispers began. At first, they were faint, barely audible. But they grew louder, overlapping and swirling around us like a storm of voices. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but their tone was unmistakable, mocking, malevolent. Annie covered her ears and screamed, tears streaming down her face. Jake clung to Gwen, his eyes wide with terror. I stood in the center of the room, my rifle in hand, but I didn't know what to aim at. The whispers came from everywhere and nowhere, taunting us, invading our minds. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The lights vanished, the whispers faded, and the house fell silent once more. But the silence wasn't comforting. It was the kind of silence that comes before a storm. That was the moment I realized the truth. We weren't dealing with random phenomena or even malevolent spirits. This was something far older, far darker, an intelligence that had claimed this land long before we arrived. And it wasn't going to let us go. "We have to leave," Gwen said, her voice breaking the silence. "Tonight." "We can't," I said, though the words felt like a death sentence. "The truck won't start, and it's too dangerous to walk." "Then what are we supposed to do?" she cried, her voice filled with desperation. I didn't have an answer. We spent the next few hours preparing for whatever was coming. Deep down, I think we all knew this was the end. The ranch wouldn't let us leave, not alive, at least. But I wasn't about to give up without a fight. I boarded up the windows and doors as best as I could, stacking furniture against the weakest points. Jake and I loaded every weapon we had: rifles, a shotgun, even the old revolver I'd inherited from my father. Gwen gathered supplies, water, blankets, a first aid kit, while Annie huddled in the corner, clutching her stuffed rabbit. The sun set slowly, as if the world itself was reluctant to plunge into darkness. By the time the last rays of light disappeared, the ranch was silent. Even the insects and birds seemed to know better than to stir. Then the lights came. This time, there was no gradual build-up, no distant glimmers on the horizon. They appeared all at once, surrounding the house in a brilliant, pulsating glow. The air grew heavy, pressing down on us like a physical weight. "We stick together," I told my family, though my voice trembled. "No matter what happens, we don't split up." The first attack came from the roof. A deafening crash shook the house as something heavy landed above us. The ceiling groaned under the weight, and we could hear it moving, slow, deliberate footsteps that sent dust raining down. "Dad!" Jake shouted, pointing toward the back door. A figure stood just outside the barricade, its silhouette outlined by the light. It was tall and spindly, with elongated limbs that bent at unnatural angles. Its glowing eyes stared directly at us, unblinking. I raised my rifle and fired. The shot shattered the silence, but the figure didn't flinch. Instead, it dissolved into the light, as though it had never been there at all. Before I could react, the front door exploded inward, sending splinters flying. Another figure stepped inside, its movements jerky and insect-like. Gwen screamed, pulling the kids behind her. I fired again, and this time, the creature let out an ear-piercing screech. It recoiled, its form flickering like a faulty projector. But it didn't retreat. It advanced slowly, its glowing eyes fixed on me. "Upstairs!" I shouted, grabbing Gwen and pushing her toward the staircase. We bolted for the second floor, slamming the door behind us and barricading it with a dresser. The whispers started again, louder this time, echoing through the walls. They weren't just in the air, they were in our heads, invading our thoughts. "Make it stop," Annie cried, covering her ears. I pulled her close, trying to shield her from the sounds, but there was no escaping them. They were everywhere, wrapping around us like a suffocating fog. The lights outside grew brighter, their glow seeping through the cracks in the walls. The floor beneath us began to vibrate, and I realized with a sickening jolt that it wasn't just the house shaking, it was the ground itself. "What do they want?" Gwen whispered, her voice barely audible over the noise. I didn't have an answer. Suddenly, the dresser blocking the door slid forward, as if pushed by an invisible force. The door creaked open, and the whispers grew deafening. A figure stepped into the room, taller and more imposing than the others. Its skin was a sickly gray, and its eyes burned with an unnatural light. It didn't move toward us. It just stood there, watching. "Stay back," I shouted, raising my rifle. The figure tilted its head, as if amused. Then it raised one spindly hand and pointed directly at Annie. "No!" Gwen screamed, pulling Annie closer. The creature stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. I fired again, but the bullets passed through it harmlessly. The air around it shimmered, distorting like heat waves. Before I could react, the lights outside surged, flooding the room with blinding intensity. I shielded my eyes, but the light burned through my eyelids, searing into my mind. The last thing I heard was Annie's voice, screaming my name. Then everything went dark. When I woke up, the house was silent. The lights were gone, and the whispers had stopped. "Gwen?" I called out, my voice hoarse. No answer. I stumbled through the house, searching every room. The barricades were gone, the doors and windows wide open. But there was no sign of my family. Outside, the ranch was eerily still. The cattle were gone, the dogs were gone, even the birds and insects were silent. The only sound was the wind rustling through the empty fields. I walked to the western pasture, where the largest light had appeared the night before. There, in the center of the field, was a massive, charred circle. The grass was blackened and burned, and the air smelled of ozone. In the center of the circle was Annie's stuffed rabbit, its fur singed and smoldering. I fell to my knees, staring at the spot where my family had vanished. They were gone, taken by something I couldn't fight, couldn't understand. The ranch had won. Weeks later, the authorities found me wandering the fields, dazed and incoherent. They called it a nervous breakdown, blaming the isolation and stress of ranch life. No one believed my story, and the ranch was eventually abandoned. But I know the truth. The ranch wasn't just haunted, it was alive. And it's still out there, waiting for its next victims.